I'm Dustin Abbott, and I'm here today to do my final review of the new Sigma 20mm f1.4 DG HSM from their ART series. Sigma has really carved out a niche for themselves in recent years by pushing the envelope of what's possible with large apertures, and they've done some creative large aperture zoom lenses that went beyond kind of the standard of f2.8 to ranges like f2, and then of course in APS-C or crop sensors even f1.8. And now they're pushing the envelope of how wide a focal length they can go and still put in that f1.4 aperture. And this becomes the widest full frame lens to have this kind of aperture in this focal length. When you try to push the envelope, you do take some extra chances. So the question that we'll try to answer here is that in trying to push the envelope of what's possible in a large aperture and a wide angle lens, has Sigma been able to succeed once again? Before I jump in, let me say that if you prefer to read your reviews or you want to see a lot more image samples and further observations, take a look at my website and you can find the written review there. I have a link down below if you want to look at that. As soon as I unboxed this lens, I was certainly impressed by the overall look and the feel of the lens. All of the ART series lenses, I feel, have a very attractive look. In many ways, I think they're the most attractive lenses being made currently. And this one certainly has a very dense, high-quality feel to it. It feels substantial in your hands, and part of that is because it is one of the heaviest lenses to be made in the ART series thus far, and it becomes the largest and heaviest lens in its class. It is not a small lens. In fact, it has an overall length of almost 130 millimeters, but it weighs in at 950 grams, and 950 grams is certainly a hefty weight. And so you know that it's there, and because of its design, there certainly is some weight towards the front of the lens as well. So if you're using this on a smaller camera body, you might find it a little bit front heavy. But of course, most of the full-frame cameras that it is really designed for, it's going to balance fairly well on them. But certainly it is a very heavy and robust lens. I don't know that the build quality is actually any better than the other ART series. It may be the overall heft of the lens that gives that impression. It was ironic, interesting, that at the same time I brought in as a comparison point this little Voigtlander. This is also a 20 millimeter focal length, except for it's a pancake lens and manual focus only, but of course the difference in size is staggering. And so it shows two very extreme approaches to this particular focal length. That aside, while this lens has a beautiful design and the mechanics of it are very nice, the focus ring moves nicely, there's just the one switch for switching between autofocus and manual focus, though it does have full ride manual override. Beyond that, I think that Sigma's first misstep perhaps comes in a lens like this, that is in a prime focal length for landscape photography. And this lens, like all of the ART series, lacks weather sealing of any kind. No special coating necessarily on this bulbous front element, and at the same time there is no kind of gasket or any mention of internal seals to keep out dust, moisture. That, to me, is a misstep here, because a lot of the competitors to this lens will offer that, and certainly it is going to be primarily competing with some of the excellent zoom lenses that cover these wide focal lengths, and many of them do offer up a quality weather sealing. And part of the time when I shot this review, I was along the Atlantic Ocean. Certainly photographers that shoot along, particularly in wave type settings, they know that every now and then a rogue wave can come in and splash their gear, and of course salt water is tough on camera gear. And so it would give you pause even if you had weather sealed, but to venture out with a lens that makes no kind of weather sealing claims is a even greater cause for concern. And so that is my first kind of knock against this lens, is when it comes to that lack of weather sealing. I think that was an oversight on Sigma's part. The other thing, of course, that comes with designing for a wider focal length like 20 millimeters, but of course also trying to design for such a large aperture in this kind of focal length, is it created out of necessity this bulbous front element. And of course, with that is a fixed lens hood. So with the fixed lens hood, you move away from a traditional kind of pinch cap to a much larger cap that has to go over that permanent lens hood that's there, which means that when you're taking that off and you're trying to put it into a pocket or something, it's much more difficult to deal with these types of caps. The other thing, of course, that comes into consideration is that you lose the ability to use traditional filters. Now, while there are third-party filter systems that already are designed for this, I personally use the Photodiax Wonder Pana system for my Tamron 15 to 30 millimeter f2.8, and they have an adapter that works for this lens as well. But for many people, of course, the loss of being able to use traditional filters becomes perhaps a deal breaker for them. But what that means is that if you're out shooting in daylight, and you want to shoot at wide apertures, you're really going to be knocking up against the maximum shutter speed limits of your camera body. And without the ability to throw an ND filter on there simply, it means that it will limit its use for some people that want to shoot in that kind of setting, perhaps for wedding photography or even doing environmental portraits. And so that becomes a bit of a liability for that. And so the build quality is kind of a series of contradictions. It's a beautifully built lens. It feels great in hand. It functions fine in the field. It's the omissions that really kind of set it back. Now, another thing that's not unusual for the Sigma lenses, is particularly the Art series, is to offer great resolution. And that's true here. Sigma has really been able to push the envelope in its optical performance. And once again, that's true with this lens, particularly in the center of the frame. Unfortunately, the corners lag a fair bit behind it. And while they're far from being bad, it is interesting to me to note and somewhat disappointing that even at f2.8, when you compare the Tamron 15 to 30 at 20 millimeters, the Tamron is actually a bit sharper in the corners than what the Sigma is, even stopped down to f2.8. But the overall center resolution, and of course resolution when it's stopped down, is really quite fantastic. It also has a very good flare resistance. I found that when I put the sun in the frame, there is basically no veiling. You can get almost just the faintest of ghosting on some occasions, but it's really, really well controlled overall. And so that's certainly a thumbs up for that. It produces very nice color rendition, and that's been true of all of these Sigma art lenses. They really are, they're very excellent optical instruments. The chromatic aberrations are also well controlled, even at wide apertures, and that is a bonus here as well. Another thing that I notice is that it really does create nice sun stars, a 9-bladed aperture, and when you stop down to f11 or so, you really get very nicely defined multi-point sun stars that are a good bonus to that. And so optically, there is a lot of goodness to refer to, but not all is perfect in that regard when it comes to the optics. Unsurprisingly, when you have such a large aperture and a wide-angle lens, you do have very heavy vignette. And expect at wide open apertures to be dealing with about 3.5 stops, which is going to intrude into your shooting. The standard profile will clear that up, but note that if you're shooting at high ISOs, there is a possibility of introducing some noise depending on your camera body. That is not necessarily unusual for a lens like this, but certainly note that it's going to be there and it's going to be obvious, and if you're shooting JPEGs, it could be more of an issue for you there. The other thing that really is a pretty huge setback for this lens is that a lot of photographers were really excited when this lens was announced because they said, wow, that would be perfect for shooting the night sky. And on paper, it is. A nice wide focal length, the ability to suck in a ton of light with an f1.4 aperture. All of that seemed great until you actually get out and you shoot the night sky, and unfortunately the coma performance leaves a lot to be desired. At the wide apertures, f1.4, f2, your stars towards the edges of the frame, they're going to grow wings and look like buzzing insects. Even when you stop it down to around f2.8, still around the edges of the frame, as you can see here, the star shapes become something like, reversed candy corn, and they're kind of elongated and fattened on one end. And so at no point is there really excellent coma performance here. And of course, if you're stopping down the lens to eliminate the coma, you are kind of eliminating the advantage that it has in terms of its aperture value. And so it still doesn't compare nearly as close to my Tamron 15 to 30 VC lens, which is kind of my current choice right now for shooting the night sky and has much better coma control beyond that. And other thing to note optically, it's kind of a more minor thing, but I did note when comparing it either to zooms set at 20 millimeters or even to the Voigtlander that the Sigma frame's a little less wide as those lenses. And so I think that the 20 millimeter is perhaps fudged a little bit more than what it is in some of these other type situations. One other thing that I do want to note to go back to praising Sigma is that this lens, like other Sigma lenses, includes a nice padded case with good protection value. One other advantage for this lens is that Sigma has managed once again to introduce the lens at a very competitive price. In the United States, its street price is $899. And of course, when you look at some of the primary lens that it competes against, that really does undercut them by a good margin. So after my review period, although I got a number of really stunning images with this lens, I'm left in a bit of a conundrum. Once again, it's an excellent lens by Sigma, and it pushes the envelope of how wide an aperture you can go here, and Sigma has successfully implemented that. But I wonder, in trying to go for the f1.4 aperture, if Sigma didn't make a bit of a misstep. They have a certain blueprint for these Art Series primes that they've really kind of stuck with, making them f1.4 and designing with certain things. And one of those things has been that there's no weather sealing in any of them. But in a kind of a prime landscape focal length, I think that Sigma maybe should have gone a different route here. If they could have designed perhaps a little less extreme lens that had better coma performance, perhaps some better weather sealing for doing landscape or even shooting portrait or weddings and being out in inclement weather. And of course, beyond that, this, bulbous front element, which I don't know if that became a necessity because of the f1.4 aperture. But all of these things limits the appeal of this lens to, you can kind of check off demographics one after another with them. They missed out on getting a huge demographic of those that love to shoot the night sky, and this lens would have been a huge seller if the coma performance had been better. Likewise, it's a great landscape lens, but because the fact that it lacks the ability to use traditional filters limits it in that case, along with the lack of weather sealing. So what you're left with is a lens that offers some really great low light performance, but perhaps is only useful for a very unique niche of people. As a result, I don't anticipate this being one of the better selling lenses in the Sigma Art series, although it is, for many intents and purposes, an excellent lens. I think that if Sigma had been willing to kind of go outside of their established box for the Art series, they might have ended up with a lens with a little bit more mass appeal. It feels kind of cheap to give a lens that really is so excellent in so many ways kind of a bit of a thumbs down. But it's not so much about the lens itself, but rather about what it could have been. And perhaps for you, if you're looking to shoot more indoors, you're shooting indoor venues and you need a wide angle of view, this is going to be a great lens for you. And for those of you that perhaps shooting wedding photography and you want to be able to do some storytelling with a little bit more narrow depth of field, this lens will also work well for you, except for the situations when you're in too bright of light to use the wide apertures that you want. And so once again, there are some limitations that come with it. And so at the end of the day, a great lens, but a lens that perhaps is going to miss the mark for a number of photographers. I'm Dustin Abbott, and if you haven't already, you can follow me on various kinds of social media. There's links down below, and if you haven't already, please subscribe. Thanks for watching.